One of the great things about Christy working for Jane Parker is Christy is an attorney, and so she goes back to those documents. You know, what do they say? And she digs, and she's a great researcher, and so she's a real asset. So if you have any questions beyond this presentation for Christy, you can of course reach her at Jane Parker's office. So now I'm going to introduce, or I've already introduced him, but it's his turn. Bruce Delgado. Okay.
My job is to inspire you to go on a hike at Fort Ord. And it's logical that if you crawl, you'll see a lot more. So you don't want to go too fast. So we're going to talk about that green swath and how it relates to Fort Ord base reuse via the Habitat Management Plan. So the Bureau of Land Management came onto the scene basically at the request of the community and a lot of inspirational vision by a former supervisor named Steve Addington, who convinced our local community that the Bureau of Land Management would do a great job conserving the natural habitat values on Fort Ord. So thanks to Steve Addington, we have a wonderful community partnership on Fort Ord, where you can, as the slide shows, equestrian, ride, hike, bring your dog, bring your bike, look around, do research. But at this point, there's no fires, camping, shooting, or hunting, off-highway motor vehicles, that sort of thing. And the sign kind of says that. Segueing off from Tom, there's some interesting signs and roads out on Fort Ord. And some would say that there's been a process going nowhere on Fort Ord, but there's a little sign above it that's called Evolution Road. And I want to show you today that there's actually a lot of great progress happening on Fort Ord. Speaking of those key habitats that are the basis for needing to protect rare species of plants and animals, toward the tops of the hills there are steep, thin-soiled slopes that have been losing their soil for centuries. And that soil drops down where it's thicker soils, more nutrients, more water. So on the top you have maritime chaparral, basically a lot of shrubs, and they're associate species of herbaceous plants and wildflowers. And toward the bottoms you have oak woodlands, and on the north-facing slopes. And then when you get to the very bottoms of a lot of these valleys, you have vernal pools, ponds, lakes, in this case a freshwater marsh that's called Mud Hen Lake. Here's Mud Hen Lake when it's in a good rain year. And then another key habitat is grasslands on Fort Ord. If you add a few trees, you could call it an oak savanna, but primarily we refer to it as grassland. And you can see there, as you would see if you went on a hike today into the grasslands, there's a band there of about 1,100 sheep. Right now there's 2,400 sheep on Fort Ord today in 2 different bands. And they rotate like clockwork. Never shall the two meet, so they don't mix. But there's 2 bands rotating with the priority of managing the grasslands. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. If you look at a map of the vegetation on Fort Ord, I'm colorblind, but I'll do my best here. What looks to me like a green or yellow line in 3 different areas. This is a 6,000 acre piece, a 1,200 acre piece, and our BLM office is a 13 acre piece. So it's approximately 7,200 acres that's currently administered by BLM, Bureau of Land Management, that the Department of Defense has transferred to BLM. In the upper right is a picture of our office, and I like it because it's 2 miles from the nearest other inhabited building. So it's a great place to work, as you can imagine. I guess the green in the southeastern lower right is grassland. The lighter color red is maritime chaparral. The burnt darker red is oak woodland. So you can see the southern half of the 6,000 acre piece is primarily grassland. The northern half of the 6,000 acre piece It is about half and half, with a little bit more maritime chaparral than oak woodland. The 1,200 acre piece has its eastern half covered mostly by oaks, and its western half, thank you, covered by maritime chaparral. So this part is maritime chaparral, and this part is oaks. The blue is or are various vernal pools and ponds and sorts of wetlands, many of which are in this area here. In the Hennekins Ranch, Barley Canyon area, that for those of you that do a lot of biking, et cetera, out there. So that's the current 7,200 acres, 1/4 the base. The base is 28,000 total acres, exactly the same size as the city of San Francisco. There's another 7,400 on top of the 7,200 that's slated to go from DOD to the Department of Interior BLM after it's cleaned up of its ordinance. So that's what we call future BLM lands. Most of that is the lighter color red of maritime chaparral with little pieces of oak woodland here and little dots of grassland. And those grasslands pieces are very important for badgers, birds. A lot of things use the grasslands that hide in the cover of the maritime chaparral, but depend on the grassland for foraging, hunting, and in some cases burrowing, et cetera. So everything's really important and tied well together. And it was Steve Addington and the Fish and Wildlife Service, Fish and Game, a lot of consultants who decided where most of the rare species were on Fort Ord and included those in that part of Fort Ord that is not slated for development. Again, the focus was rare plants and animals and their habitats. The 7,200 acres that we, the Bureau of Land Management, administer now has a good piece of maritime chaparral, almost equally occupied by oak woodland, grasslands. And although it sounds like a small acreage of wetlands, that's a lot of wetland, and that's great. I often say if you're a bird flying from Alaska to Mexico, you have to have Burger Kings to stop at. You just can't fly nonstop. And so for migratory birds, these pools on Fort Ord and all the wetlands that are left in California serve a much larger purpose than their size might indicate. In the future, as we saw on the map, most of the BLM acres are going to be maritime chaparral with a small amount of additional oak woodland, grassland, and then again, an important contingent of vernal pools and ponds, et cetera. On a broader map, here's the current BLM, here's the future BLM, here's the state parks where Ken Gray worked for so many years. Out near the airport, we have UCM Best and Marina City reserve lands. So the numbers change, but if you go by these numbers that I've collected, it's or referenced from other sources, it's in the habitat management areas, it's about 64 habitat, 36 development, and so I think of it as a 64-36 split, something in that ballpark. Nowadays, when you go out there, you'll see the limitations around the future BLM lands where a lot of unexploded ordnance is currently being cleared each day. Not a day goes by, Monday through Thursday, especially where things get cleared, sometimes on Fridays by the FORA munitions crews. So there's where some of the signs are. They've become more politically correct over time. In this one was at the entrance of the BLM. Apparently, these dangerous items aren't so dangerous. Maybe what you need to worry about is you lose your shoe and you get a few holes in your pants. That's a questionable slide. Lots of questionable slides. So that was the recreation of Fort Ord, and we left you with the tail end of the recreation slides. But what those recreation slides showed were a lot of horseback riding, competitive mountain biking, competitive road cycling, recreational mountain biking and road cycling, dogs, festivals. Even though the signs look dangerous, those who have been frequenting Fort Ord the last 20 years know full well that there's approximately 100,000 people that come and enjoy Fort Ord in a very safe manner, especially on those BLM lands. A lot of people, like as in this photo, are doing nature studies. There's so much to see on Fort Ord between the animals and plants and insects. Lower left, there's a fly agaricus, a very beautiful mushroom, some shooting stars on the right, a swallowtail on some lilies called blue dicks up in the upper right. We've had 13 successive annual mushroom forays and sautés where we take up to a couple hundred people mushroom hunting, and then we eat the ones that we can find that are edible and delicious, and then we teach people which ones are the poisonous ones, like this destroying angel mushroom that looks a lot like some of the edibles, but it's one of the worst, most deadliest. This is a David Steyer photo. Many of you know David Steyer. Just to show you up close, a beautiful rain orchid, which is a quite rare orchid, but not as rare as some of the endangered species, but it's called Michael's rain orchid. Now, at this time of year, this is starting to happen, although our spring is a little delayed. We have a Mariposa lily, and there are tens of thousands of them that come every year around this time, and maybe a little bit later this month, I should say, that cover places like this is Machine Gun Flats. Very beautiful wet meadows, and there's a lot of them on Fort Ord. This fritillary is another lily, and it's pretty in its own way for sure, but I think the fruit is just as pretty and interesting looking as the flower itself. So of course all these flowers go to fruit, and that's what they depend on to replenish their seed banks every year. So you got to have the fruits to do that. Up close of the Indian warrior. This is one of our endangered species called Contra Costa goldfields. It was named because it was first discovered up in Contra Costa County, a sunflower member and in the family of sunflowers. It was down to Santa Barbara historically. It disappeared, it's been extirpated, thought all the way up to San Francisco Bay Area until in 1997, by surprise, it was discovered on Fort Ord. So it's not in the Habitat Management Plan, but it has been folded into the Habitat Conservation Plan, which is the successor document to the Habitat Management Plan, and now in draft form, soon to be released to the public, is my understanding. So Contra Costa goldfields grows in vernal pools when they dry up, and its buddy is often the white flowering Hickman's popcorn flower itself is a very unusual plant. The Habitat Management Plan, the HMP, has management requirements for each parcel of land that's part of a habitat management strategy. And those requirements BLM holds to the best that we can. It's an Army Habitat Management Plan signed by the Army, and they were the lead on it, but we at BLM do all that we can to implement the Habitat Management Plan. So I'll go through some of those activities that are going on since BLM came on the scene in 1993. Back to these gold fields, you can see how beautiful these vernal pools are after they dry up, and they have their rings of wildflowers. In 2004 started getting inundated by wild pigs, which can be very cute, curious, smart, family-oriented, industrious, and high confident animals, but they're also prolific. And in this, we have 3 toddlers, we have a juvenile, and probably a mother sow. So we have 3 generations. They can have a couple litters a year of 5 to 10 piglets each, and they can be very numerous. And this is what they've done. I don't know if it shows up, but that's the Contra Costa goldfields after it's been rototilled by the wild pigs on Fort Ord. So our charge is to implement the HMP, which means protecting rare plants and animals from whatever the outside forces might be. And so we, in 2006, started removing, with the help of the Army, the wild pigs from Fort Ord. The Army helps fund it, BLM helps fund it, and as partners, we've removed 108 wild pigs, and we think there's a handful left, which are smarter than we are, so we have to change tactics, and we're not sure where we're going next. But just to show before the pigs and after the pigs, and so we've got to do something. So we're working on that. A plant that I really love growing nearby those vernal pools, something called Johnny Nip, related to the Indian paintbrush. Animals that depend on these vernal pools include this endangered species called California tiger salamander. Here it's a tadpole, it's a larval stage. It has gills, sort of like fish, that don't require it to come to the surface for oxygen. When it goes into the adult form, it loses the gills, it has lungs like we do, it needs to come up for air to breathe. Here is a non-native hybrid individual from Arizona that was brought to Salinas area ponds. It's moved on to Fort Ord. It's breeding with the native, and the Fish and Wildlife Service states in its listing report when it listed this animal as an endangered species that a chief threat to this species is the hybridization from the barred salamander, the guy up in the upper right. So we're doing a little bit to work on that. One that people often mistake is an arboreal salamander with smaller spots, smaller body features, but it's easily mistaken for a California tiger salamander. But these are really neat salamanders that usually are found under logs in wet oak woodland areas. We have western toads that show up in the tens of thousands on good rain years. Beautifully colored tails on the western skink, that one of the animals in the dry land. We have lots of different species of snakes. And I just wanted to point out, anytime you see a pointy tip to the tail, it's not a venomous snake. The only one that is venomous in California is the rattlesnake, which of course has a blunt tip tail because of the rattles. So it's some comfort when you see a snake on Fort Ord, or in California when you see the tails come to a point, then you can relax for the most part. On some of our field trips, we run into a beautiful non-native, a native ground nesting bee that makes millions of holes, literally, in different areas of Fort Ord, and they don't land on you, and so therefore they don't sting or bite you. They just swarm around, and to walk through a swarm of buzzing bees is quite an experience that you'll remember for a long time. And we call this the Serengeti of Fort Ord when we have this bee phenomenon happening, and it's really cool. And there's a lot of phenomena like that do occur out on Fort Ord. We have a good, healthy population of badgers. Their primary source of mortality is getting hit on Reservation and Highway 68, Reservation Road and Highway 68. Interior to Fort Ord, they deal with diseases and parasites and things like that, but their chief mortality agent is the roadside mortalities. We have interesting birds. The roadrunner is not a rare bird, but it's not one you think about, and you do see them around on Fort Ord, so it's quite a treat. And then we do have a rare bird that's declining throughout the state of California called the burrowing owl, a very neat owl that burrows in the ground and comes out in the daytime as much as in the nighttime. Really a neat species of bird. We have some trees on Fort Ord and species of plants that don't grow anywhere else in Monterey County. This one is called Palmer's oak. It has a characteristic right angle growth to its branches, which helps identify it. But I put this in because there's many species on Fort Ord that you don't see on any lists. But for our county, they're rare, and it's the only place you can see them. And it just goes to show the wide diversity of 900 different plants growing on Fort Ord. We have a lot of listed species, which some of us do hear a lot about, and these are the characters that prompted the benefit of having a 60-40 split or 65-35 in favor of the environment. Most of these species overwhelmingly use maritime chaparral, although they can be found in oak woodland situations, and then others use vernal pools, and then there are a couple that depend on the beach. So that's why most of the oak woodlands are in those developed areas, and the maritime chaparral and vernal pools are in the set-aside areas. Some ponds that can turn quite beautiful. Here with a water fern, we have 95% of the distribution of this species. To have the 95% of any species world distribution means that it depends on Fort Ord for its future. Burning is part of the Habitat Management Plan requirements. It'll be part of the Habitat Conservation Plan requirements. BLM and the Army and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service understand that maritime chaparral needs to burn, and even before it rains after a fire, things start to resprout. Doesn't even need the moisture for that coming from above the ground. After the fire, you have the most beautiful sights that you'll behold, beautiful wildflowers that depend on those fires. We have a lot of roads that we do restoration on. This is a typical road before we address it. 2 years later, this color shows all the different spots that we have restored on Fort Ord. It's a little out of date, but it's an impressive number. We're up to 110 sites. There's a 6'4" man standing in a hole of a road that looks like that before we treat it. 1 month after, 2 years, 7 years, 11 years, you wouldn't know there was a road 11 years ago. A helipad, an Army helipad before, during, with kids, buses coming from local schools. 2 years later, 11 years later, you wouldn't know it was a helipad. This is one of my favorite. Bulldozers would clear this out every year to allow vehicles. We brought bulldozers in who caused the problem, and as a fix, they're a great tool for the fix. We have people who come out on weekends with music around Valentine's Day of a Jalisco harpist. They seed, they straw, they plant. Remember, this is what it looked like in '05. That's what it looks like in 2011, 2005, 2011. We have a lot of volunteers we depend on to do weed work. We have weeds located all around Fort Ord, one of which is not found elsewhere in the Western or Northern Hemisphere, just on Fort Ord. So it's an interesting connection between probably South Africa, Europe, and the United States, how it got here during times of war. It's 400 acres of colored area there that's pretty much beyond our control. We have lots of other kinds of weeds on Fort Ord, and we use sheep in the grasslands for wildland weed control and also fire hazard reduction. The white guys are mama ewes that have been sheared. The darker ones are the lambs that are getting ready to go off to a market, and their pelts, their hides are worth more, so they don't get shorn, they don't get sheared. We have Sheep Appreciation Day coming, the first in the history of planet Earth's 4.5 billion years we've been here, but not until May 26th, a Saturday, will we have Sheep Appreciation Day. You get to see sheep being sheared, and you get to see, if you win a raffle ticket, you get to see sheep herding dogs herd the sheep. We depend on volunteers to plant oaks where the sheep eat the oak seedlings, where we have isolated groves of dead and dying oak trees, such as this oak tree, which is actually dead. There's a dying one behind it. Santa Catalina High School girls and kids of all ages from lots of schools. The Habitat Management Plan, like I mentioned earlier, was an Army plan, and everyone on Fort Ord's agreed to abide by it. What it doesn't do is give non-federal entities like the cities and counties the right to take, harm, harass endangered species. It doesn't give them a permit to do that. So we bring in the Habitat Conservation Plan, which is very complimentary and for the most part supersedes the Habitat Management Plan when it's finally signed. And it is the mechanism for what we call incidental take. So if you're a developer and you're doing everything legal, and in doing so you incidentally are going to have to take or harm endangered species, then you will have an incidental take permit once the Habitat Conservation Plan and its associated EIR, et cetera, are all done. So there'll be a blanket base-wide permit for non-federal entities once the Habitat Conservation Plan process is finished. So that's why we need that on top of the Habitat Management Plan. One of our best volunteers died while working on volunteering on Fort Ord. Many of us are allergic and don't know it. He was allergic to insect stings, and within 4 minutes he collapsed and never came to. And that's Chuck Hogan. Many of you have heard about the Chuck Hogan Conservation Fund. We bring as many children out to try to indoctrinate them that nature is not a dangerous, but it's a miraculous place to spend time. There's David Steyer, our prime volunteer. An incredible list of plants. Thousands of hours have been spent dividing Fort Ord into 71 pieces and doing species list year-round. He's now in his 9th year of things like the rain orchid, showing you where on Fort Ord you can find that rain orchid in those 71 areas. If you're in the 71 club, that means you're in all 71 areas. It's a very coveted club to be part of. But one of the most important things that is not intuitive is that more than any other, most of the plants on Fort Ord grow in one area. Then the next most frequent category, plants to grow in 2 of those 70 areas, and 3, and 4, and 5. And so over half of all the 900 species of plants that grow on Fort Ord grow in 5 or fewer zones. So it's just to point out that we do need to do as good a job as we can protecting the species on Fort Ord, because most of them grow in only a few places. We have a volunteer that's researching bobcats. Basically, she finds them and follows them and takes photos and identifies them, and she's doing a great job. Her name is Kathy Bell. This is a bobcat in courtship behavior, beautiful bobcat. So I think that we are making progress. We're using science as our base, sort of in Darwinian fashion, and these roads really do exist out on Fort Ord. And that's it. Thank you.